You think you know power. You think you know ambition. Get ready to ditch the fluffy history books because we're diving deep into the shadowy halls of Europe's most iconic royal family, the Habsburgs. These weren't your average monarchs who just sat on thrones and looked pretty. No, the Habsburgs wrote the playbook on how to conquer, control, and rule with an iron fist, leaving a trail of broken kingdoms, silenced rebellions, and breathtakingly cold-blooded political maneuvers in their wake. Their story isn't just about glittering crowns and grand palaces. It's about the shocking, ruthless decisions that built an empire so vast, the sun literally never set on it. Forget what you thought you knew. This is the real unvarnished story of 9 times the Habsburgs proved they were willing to do anything to win. Number 9. The mass expulsion of the Moriscos. The year is 1609. Spain is a kingdom, yes, but it is also a land of simmering resentments and lingering suspicions. For centuries, the Iberian Peninsula, what we now call Spain and Portugal, had been a mosaic of cultures and faiths. Christian kingdoms had slowly, relentlessly pushed back against Muslim rule in a centuries-long conflict known as the Reconquista. But even after the final Muslim stronghold, Granada fell in 1492. Millions of former Muslims remained. They were called Mudijars, and later, if they converted to Christianity, Moriscos. Now these Moriscos, descendants of the former Muslim rulers and inhabitants, found themselves caught in a tightening vice of suspicion and intolerance. King Philip II, the stern and devout Habsburg monarch who ruled Spain before his son, had been obsessed with religious unity. He believed a kingdom divided in faith was a kingdom weakened. While he did not outright expel the Moriscos, he imposed harsh laws, banning their language, their traditional clothes, and their customs. This led to a major rebellion in the Alpujarras region of Granada in the late 1560s, a brutal war that lasted for years and resulted in thousands of deaths and the forced relocation of many Moriscos. But even after this uprising was crushed, the problem from the perspective of the Spanish crown and many of its nobles persisted. Were the Moriscos truly Christian, or were they secretly practicing Islam? Were they loyal subjects? Or would they conspire with the Ottoman Empire or the Barbary pirates who constantly raided Spain's coasts? These questions gnawed at the heart of the kingdom. When Philip III ascended to the throne in 1598, he inherited this volatile situation. Unlike his father, Philip III was known to be less hands-on with government, often delegating heavily to his chief minister Francisco Gómez de Sandoval, Duke of Lerma. Yet when it came to the Moriscos, a consensus began to form among the powerful figures at court. The problem needed a definitive, drastic solution. The economy was struggling. Many noblemen coveted the fertile lands that the industrious Moriscos farmed, especially in the Kingdom of Valencia. Religious figures, particularly Archbishop Juan de Ribera of Valencia, argued passionately that the Moriscos were an internal enemy, a cancer on the pure Catholic body of Spain. They claimed that the Moriscos were secretly aiding Spain's enemies, that their conversions were fake, and that their continued presence threatened the very soul of the kingdom. On April 9, 1609, the order was given. Philip III, after years of debate and pressure, signed the edict for the expulsion of the Moriscos from the Kingdom of Valencia. It was not a suggestion. It was a command, backed by the full force of the Spanish state. The decree stated that all Moriscos without exception must leave the kingdom within 3 days, taking only what they could carry. Their property, their homes, their land, all of it would be confiscated by the crown, ostensibly to pay for the cost of their expulsion, but in reality it often ended up in the hands of the very nobles who had lobbied for the expulsion. The edict promised death to any Morisco found after the deadline. The scene that unfolded in Valencia was one of unimaginable chaos and despair. Thousands upon thousands of men, women, and children were rounded up, often at sword point, and marched to the nearest ports. They were forced onto ships often overcrowded and unsanitary, bound for North Africa, mainly the Barbary coast. Accounts from the time describe families torn apart, elderly people collapsing from exhaustion, and children crying for lost parents. Many died on the journey from disease, starvation, or violence. Some ships were attacked by pirates, others simply sank. Those who made it to North Africa often faced a hostile reception, as their Spanish language and customs made them alien even there. They were Christians in the eyes of their former Spanish neighbors, but foreigners and potentially spies in the eyes of the North Africans. The expulsion was not limited to Valencia. Over the next 5 years, between 1609 and 1614, similar edicts were issued for other regions of Spain: Andalusia, Murcia, Aragon, Catalonia, and Castile. Each region presented its own challenges, but the brutal efficiency of the operation remained. It is estimated that around 300,000 Moriscos, roughly 4% of Spain's total population at the time, were forcibly removed from their homes. This was a colossal demographic shift, and it was carried out with a cold, calculated precision that left little room for mercy or appeal. The economic consequences for Spain were devastating in many regions. The Moriscos were skilled farmers, artisans, and laborers. Their forced departure left vast tracts of land uncultivated, especially in Valencia and Aragon, leading to severe agricultural decline. Industries that relied on their labor, like sugar production and silk weaving, suffered immensely. Villages were depopulated. While some of the confiscated lands were indeed distributed to Christian nobles, many struggled to find enough labor to work them effectively. The Spanish economy, already fragile, received a crippling blow from which it would take decades, even centuries, to recover fully. For Philip III and his advisors, the expulsion was a success. Spain was now, in their eyes, a truly unified Catholic kingdom. The perceived threat of an internal enemy was removed. The crown had asserted its absolute authority over its subjects, even those who had lived in Spain for generations. Yet, this act of ruthless ethnic cleansing, driven by religious zeal and economic opportunism, scarred the nation for generations and left a dark stain on the legacy of the Habsburg dynasty in Spain. It demonstrated a chilling willingness to sacrifice human lives and economic stability for the sake of perceived purity and absolute control, a decision made in the quiet chambers of power and enforced with brutal efficiency. Apostoland. Number 8. Franz Joseph's crushing of Hungarian freedom. The year is 1848. Europe is ablaze with revolution. From Paris to Berlin, from Vienna to Budapest, the people are rising up against the old order, demanding freedom, reform, and national self-determination. The Habsburg Empire, a vast multinational realm, ruled from Vienna, finds itself particularly vulnerable. It is a patchwork of peoples: Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, Croats, Romanians, and many more, all living under the same imperial crown, but with their own languages, cultures, and growing national aspirations. In March of that year, the revolutionary fervor reaches Hungary, one of the most significant parts of the empire. Inspired by events in Vienna, where a popular uprising had forced the resignation of the long-serving Chancellor Metternich, Hungarian liberals and nationalists begin to demand far-reaching reforms. They want greater autonomy for Hungary within the empire, a representative parliament, freedom of the press, and the abolition of serfdom. A brilliant lawyer and orator named Lajos Kossuth quickly emerges as the mythic leader of the Hungarian cause. He delivers fiery speeches, stirring national pride and a desire for true self-governance. Initially, the Habsburg monarchy, under the aging and weak-willed Emperor Ferdinand I, seems unable to cope. The imperial court in Vienna is in disarray. To avoid further bloodshed and widespread rebellion, Vienna grants significant concessions to the Hungarians, including their own government, and a large degree of autonomy. It looks like a victory for freedom. However, this period of seeming peace is short-lived. In December 1848, a new young emperor ascends to the Habsburg throne, Franz Joseph I. He is just 18 years old, but he is determined, conservative, and believes deeply in the divine right of emperors. He sees the concessions granted to Hungary not as a necessary compromise, but as a dangerous erosion of imperial authority that must be reversed. Franz Joseph, advised by hardline ministers, decides that the time for negotiation is over. The Hungarian Revolution must be crushed by force. The problem, however, is that the Hungarian Revolutionary Army, led by skilled generals and bolstered by fervent national support, is proving to be far more formidable than the Habsburgs anticipated. The Hungarians, fighting for their newfound freedom and homeland, achieve a series of stunning victories against the imperial forces throughout the spring of 1849. They push the Habsburg army back, declare full independence from the Habsburg Empire, and even dethrone Franz Joseph, though this is purely symbolic. By early summer, Hungary is virtually free, and its army is a potent fighting force. Franz Joseph faces a dire situation. His own forces are struggling, and the very existence of the Habsburg Empire seems to hang in the balance. But Franz Joseph is a pragmatist, and he is willing to make a cold, calculated decision to preserve his dynasty's power. He turns to an unlikely yet powerful ally, Tsar Nicholas I of Russia, the ultra-conservative ruler known as the Gendarme of Europe for his willingness to suppress liberal uprisings. Nicholas I, fearing that the revolutionary fire in Hungary might spread to his own Polish territories, readily agrees to help. In June 1849, a massive Russian army, numbering over 200,000 soldiers, pours into Hungary from the east. It is an overwhelming force, far larger and better equipped than anything the Hungarians can muster. Simultaneously, Habsburg imperial armies, now reinforced and emboldened, press in from the west. The Hungarian army, despite its bravery and earlier successes, is caught between two mighty powers. The fight is fierce, but the odds are insurmountable. By August, after a final, desperate stand, the Hungarian forces are utterly defeated. What follows is a period of brutal reprisals. Franz Joseph, still young but already displaying an unforgiving nature, orders widespread arrests and executions. General Julius von Haynau, known as the Hyena of Brescia for his cruelty in suppressing an Italian uprising, is appointed commander-in-chief in Hungary and carries out the emperor's will with chilling efficiency. On October 6, 1849, a grim day for Hungarian history, 13 Hungarian generals are executed in Ahrid, a city that becomes a symbol of the suppression. Many more officers and civilian leaders are imprisoned, exiled, or subjected to harsh sentences. The independent Hungarian government is dismantled, and Hungary is placed under direct military rule from Vienna. The Hungarian constitution is suspended, and the country is effectively treated as a conquered province. The suppression of the Hungarian Revolution of 1848–49 stands as a stark testament to Franz Joseph's ruthless determination to maintain centralized imperial control. He was willing to invite a foreign power to invade his own rebellious subjects, sacrificing national pride and risking international condemnation, all to preserve the unity and absolute authority of his family's empire. The wounds of this brutal suppression would fester for decades, shaping the political landscape of the Habsburg Empire and ultimately leading to the Compromise of 1867, which created the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary, a reluctant dual monarchy of Auris, forced upon Vienna by the memory of the revolution. But in 1849 it was a display of raw, uncompromising power, a young emperor showing the world that he would stop at nothing to secure his throne. Number 7. Leopold I's iron will against the Ottomans. The late 17th century was a time of immense peril and breathtaking triumph for the Habsburgs. For centuries, the Ottoman Empire, a formidable Islamic power based in Constantinople, had been a constant threat to Christian Europe. Their vast armies had swept across the Balkans, conquering territory after territory, and repeatedly pushing against the borders of the Habsburg domains. For generations, the rivalry between the two empires had defined much of Central and Eastern European politics, marked by intermittent wars, uneasy truces, and the ever-present fear of another Ottoman invasion. Under Sultan Mehmed IV, and led by the ambitious Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, a colossal Ottoman army, perhaps 150,000 strong, marched northward with Vienna, the capital of the Habsburg Empire, as its ultimate prize. Emperor Leopold I, the shrewd and deeply religious Habsburg ruler, understood the gravity of the situation. Vienna was not just his capital. It was a symbol, a bulwark of Christian Europe. If it fell, the path to the heart of the continent would be open to the Ottomans. As the Ottoman siege engines began to pound the formidable walls of Vienna, Leopold I, along with his court, made the difficult decision to evacuate, seeking refuge in Linz. This was not an act of cowardice, but a strategic move to preserve the continuity of the government and to rally support from other European powers. The defenders of Vienna, led by Count Ernst Rudiger von Starhemberg, put up a heroic resistance, enduring relentless bombardments, mining operations, and daily assaults. They held out for weeks, suffering terribly, their supplies dwindling but their resolve unbroken. Meanwhile, Leopold I and his diplomats worked tirelessly. He appealed to the Pope, to the German princes, and most crucially, to King Jan III Sobieski of Poland, Lithuania. Leopold knew that only a united Christian force could break the siege. Through intense negotiations, often fraught with political squabbles and mutual distrust, the Holy League was formed. It was a coalition of Habsburg forces, German contingents, and the Polish-winged Hussars, one of the most feared cavalry units of the era. On September 12, 1683, in one of the most decisive battles in European history, the combined Christian relief army, led by King Sobieski, descended from the Kahlenberg Hills. Overlooking Vienna, the battle was a thunderous clash of armies, a desperate fight for the survival of the city and many believed of Christian Europe itself. The Polish winged hussars, in a legendary charge, broke the Ottoman lines, shattering their morale and forcing a chaotic retreat. Vienna was saved. But for Leopold I, the relief of Vienna was not an end. It was a beginning. The Ottoman Empire, though repelled, was still a powerful foe. Leopold, seeing an unprecedented opportunity to permanently push back the Ottoman tide and expand Habsburg influence, adopted a relentless and uncompromising strategy of war. He transformed the Holy League from a defensive alliance into an offensive juggernaut. He entrusted his armies to brilliant commanders like Prince Eugene of Savoy, a military genius who would become one of Europe's greatest generals. Over the next 16 years, the Habsburgs, often in alliance with Venice, Poland, and Russia, waged a series of brutal and successful campaigns known as the Great Turkish War. It was a long, costly, and bloody conflict that stretched across the plains of Hungary and the Balkans. The Habsburg armies, under Leopold's unwavering direction and Eugene's masterful tactics, systematically dismantled Ottoman power in Central Europe. Key victories followed one after another. The Battle of Mohacs in 1687, which avenged a devastating defeat suffered by the Hungarians and Habsburgs almost 160 years earlier. The capture of Belgrade in 1688, a strategically vital Ottoman stronghold. And most decisively, the Battle of Zenta in 1697. At Zenta, Prince Eugene, against overwhelming odds, launched a surprise attack on the main Ottoman army, utterly destroying it and killing the Grand Vizier. It was a catastrophic defeat for the Ottomans, signaling the end of their era of expansion in Europe. Leopold I's determination was absolute. He poured resources into the war, endured setbacks, and maintained a singular focus on achieving a definitive victory. His willingness to sustain a long attritional conflict and his ability to harness the military talents of his commanders demonstrated a profound and ruthless strategic mind. He saw an opportunity to permanently shift the balance of power in Central Europe, and he seized it with unwavering resolve. The war finally concluded with the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699. This treaty was a triumph for the Habsburgs and a disaster for the Ottomans. The Habsburg Empire gained vast territories. Nearly all of Hungary, Transylvania, Croatia, and Slavonia. Its borders were pushed hundreds of miles to the south and east, transforming it into a major European power with an empire that stretched from the North Sea to the Balkans. Leopold I's role in this was pivotal. He was not a military general, but he was the driving force behind the sustained war effort. He demonstrated a ruthless political will, never wavering in his objective to destroy the Ottoman threat and expand his dynastic domains, even at the cost of immense human suffering and financial strain. His vision and tenacity laid the groundwork for the Habsburg Empire's golden age in the 18th century. But it was forged in the fires of relentless war and uncompromising expansion. Number 6. Ferdinand I's religious purge in Austria. The mid-16th century was a tumultuous time for Europe, fractured by the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther's teachings had swept across the Holy Roman Empire, finding fertile ground in many German states, and even within the hereditary lands of the Habsburgs. By the 1550s, Protestantism, particularly Lutheranism, had made significant inroads in Austria, Bohemia, and Hungary, sometimes even attracting powerful noble families. This presented a profound challenge to the traditional Catholic authority of the Habsburg emperors, who saw themselves as the chief defenders of the faith. Emperor Charles V, the older brother of Ferdinand I, had struggled for decades to suppress Protestantism across the Holy Roman Empire. His efforts had led to devastating religious wars, culminating in the Peace of Habsburg. In 1555, this landmark agreement allowed princes within the Holy Roman Empire to choose either Catholicism or Lutheranism as the official religion of their territories, following the principle of cuius regio e religio, whose realm his religion. While this brought a fragile peace to the empire, it also solidified religious divisions and formally recognized Protestantism. When Charles V abdicated in 1556, he divided his vast empire. His son, Philip II, inherited Spain, the Netherlands, and Italy. His brother, Ferdinand I, inherited the Habsburg hereditary lands, Austria, Bohemia, Hungary, and the title of Holy Roman Emperor. Ferdinand was a deeply religious man, a devout Catholic who believed passionately in the unity of the Church. Unlike his brother Charles V, who had sometimes been willing to negotiate with Protestants for political expediency, Ferdinand had a more steadfast, uncompromising vision for his own domains. He recognized the Peace of Augsburg for the empire, but within his own hereditary lands he intended to restore Catholic supremacy with a firm hand. Ferdinand understood that outright military conquest like the brutal wars Charles V had fought might not be the most effective strategy within his own borders. Instead, he pursued a more systematic, legalistic, and institution-based form of recatholicization. It was a slow, grinding campaign, but no less ruthless for its methodical nature. One of Ferdinand's key tools was the Society of Jesus, or Jesuits. This new, highly disciplined Catholic order, founded by Ignatius of Loyola, was dedicated to education and missionary work, specifically to counter the spread of Protestantism. Ferdinand recognized their potential and actively encouraged their establishment in his lands. He brought Jesuits into Vienna, Innsbruck, and other key cities, providing them with resources to establish schools, universities, and seminaries. These Jesuit institutions became centers of fervent Catholic intellectual life and propaganda, training new generations of priests and teachers who would educate the youth in strict Catholic doctrine. Beyond education, Ferdinand employed a range of administrative and legal measures. He began appointing only Catholics to high positions in his administration, effectively blocking Protestants from holding powerful offices. He controlled appointments to the church hierarchy, ensuring that bishops and abbots were loyal Catholics who would actively promote recatholicization. He used his authority to supervise printing presses, limiting the publication of Protestant materials and promoting Catholic writings. For Protestant nobles who had converted or tolerated Protestantism on their estates, Ferdinand exerted immense pressure. While he did not immediately resort to mass expulsions like Philip III in Spain, he made it increasingly difficult for them to practice their faith openly. He encouraged Catholic priests to preach in Protestant areas, used inquisitorial tribunals to investigate heresy, and slowly chipped away at the rights and privileges of Protestant communities. Records show how Protestant churches were sometimes closed, their ministers expelled, and their congregations forced to attend Catholic services. For many, the choice was simple: convert or face severe economic and social disadvantages, or even outright persecution. This systematic approach had a profound impact. While it did not immediately eradicate Protestantism, it stopped its growth and began a slow but steady reversal. By the end of Ferdinand's reign in 1564, the tide had begun to turn. The groundwork was laid for a more aggressive counter-reformation in the next century, which would see his descendants continue and intensify his policies, leading to the brutal enforcement of Catholicism that would spark the 30 Years' War. Ferdinand I's actions represented chillingly effective, though often understated, form of ruthlessness. He did not engage in large-scale massacres or immediate expulsions, but his long-term strategy of using bureaucratic power, educational institutions, and subtle but persistent pressure to suppress a competing religion. He demonstrated that control over hearts and minds achieved through consistent institutional pressure could be as devastating to religious freedom as any army. He laid the foundation for the deep-seated religious tensions that would explode in Central Europe, ultimately shaping the fate of millions and demonstrating the Habsburg commitment to absolute religious conformity within their hereditary lands. Number 5. Maximilian I's unrivaled marriage chessboard. Forget dragons and epic battles. The most powerful weapon in the Habsburg arsenal for centuries was not a sword, but a wedding ring. And the grandmaster of this particular strategic game was Emperor Maximilian I, who ruled from the late 15th century to the early 16th century. His reign marks a turning point for the Habsburg dynasty, transforming them from powerful regional rulers into a truly global superpower, all through a series of shrewd, cold, and immensely effective marriage alliances. Maximilian inherited a relatively modest collection of territories. The core was Austria, with some scattered lands in southern Germany. But Maximilian had a vision not of military conquest but of dynastic expansion through carefully arranged unions. He understood that a well-placed marriage could bring more landpower and wealth than a costly war. In fact, a famous Habsburg motto, attributed to his time, perfectly encapsulates this strategy. Let others wage wars, you happy Austria, marry. For the realms that Mars to others gives, Venus will give to you. This wasn't about love. It was about power, pure and simple. Maximilian's first great move came in 1477 when he married Mary of Burgundy. Mary was the sole heiress to the vast and incredibly wealthy Burgundian lands, which included modern-day Belgium, the Netherlands, and parts of France. This was an enormous prize, highly coveted by the powerful French king Louis XI. Maximilian, often called the last knight for his love of chivalry, did fight a war against France to secure his inheritance. But the foundation was laid by the marriage itself. This union brought the Low Countries, with their booming trade and rich cities like Bruges and Antwerp, directly into Habsburg control. It was a staggering increase in wealth and influence, but Maximilian was just getting started. His most audacious and apple move involved his children. He orchestrated a double marriage with the royal family of Spain. His son, Philip the Fair, was married to Joanna of Castile, known later as Joanna the Mad. Simultaneously, Maximilian's daughter, Margaret of Austria, was married to Joanna's brother, Prince John, the heir to the Spanish throne. This was a masterstroke. The plan was to forge a powerful alliance between the Habsburgs and a newly unified, rapidly expanding Kingdom of Spain, which had just discovered vast new territories across the Atlantic. Life, however, often throws wrenches into the best-laid plans. Prince John died unexpectedly, making his sister Joanna the heiress to the Spanish throne. Then in 1506, Philip the Fair also died young, leaving Joanna a widow, grieving and increasingly unstable, and their young son Charles as the heir to an unimaginable inheritance. This twist of fate, tragic for the individuals involved, was a stroke of incredible luck for the Habsburg dynasty. When Charles came of age, he inherited the immense legacy, assembled by his grandfather Maximilian. From his mother Joanna, he inherited the Spanish kingdoms of Castile and Aragon, with their rich possessions in Italy, and crucially their vast and growing colonial empire in the Americas. From his father, Philip, he inherited the Burgundian lands, the Netherlands and Belgium, which his grandfather Maximilian had acquired. And from his other grandfather, Maximilian himself, he inherited the traditional Habsburg hereditary lands of Austria, along with a claim to the Holy Roman Empire. Suddenly, almost overnight, the young Charles V, Maximilian's grandson, found himself ruling an empire so vast that it truly stretched across the globe. From the silver mines of Mexico to the trading ports of Antwerp, from the plains of Hungary to the spice islands of the East Indies, the sun literally never set on his domains. This was not achieved through centuries of bloody conquest, but through a handful of strategically brilliant, cold-blooded arranged marriages. Maximilian's approach was a testament to a ruthless kind of foresight. He viewed his children and grandchildren not just as beloved family, but as pawns on a grand Yule chessboard. Their personal happiness or desires were secondary to the dynastic imperative. Marriages were contracts, alliances, and tools for expansion. The alliances he forged were designed to encircle rival powers, particularly France, and to consolidate the Habsburg grip on Europe. The long-term impact of Maximilian's marriage policy was immense. It set the stage for the Habsburg centuries of dominance, creating a dynasty that shaped European history, culture, and politics like no other. It demonstrated a chillingly effective method of acquiring power, one that required patience, strategic vision, and an unwavering commitment to dynastic ambition over all else. The saying, "Let others wage wars, you happy Austria marry," became a true reflection of the Habsburg spirit. A policy of bloodless acquisition that nonetheless reshaped the map of the world. Number 4. Maria Theresa's bare-knuckle fight for her crown. When Charles VI, the Habsburg emperor, died in 1740, a political earthquake shook Europe. For decades, Charles had been obsessed with ensuring that his vast, diverse empire, known as the Habsburg monarchy, would pass intact to his eldest daughter, Maria Theresa. He had no male heirs, and under traditional Habsburg law and Salic law practiced elsewhere in Europe, a woman could not inherit the imperial throne or many of the constituent crowns of the empire. To bypass this, he had issued the Pragmatic Sanction in 1713, a document declaring the indivisibility of the Habsburg lands and the right of his female heirs to succeed him. He then spent the rest of his reign and much of his treasury securing recognition for this document from the various European powers. Despite all his efforts, the ink was barely dry on his death certificate before the vultures began to circle. Maria Theresa was just 23 years old, relatively inexperienced, and, crucially, a woman. Many European rulers who had formally recognized the Pragmatic Sanction now saw an irresistible opportunity to carve up the Habsburg Empire, acquire valuable territory, and weaken their ancient rival. The first blow came swiftly and brutally from a young, ambitious king who had just ascended the throne of Prussia, Frederick II, later known as Frederick the Great. He immediately invaded Silesia, a rich industrial province of the Habsburg Empire, without any declaration of war or valid pretext. This act of blatant aggression sparked the War of the Austrian Succession. Suddenly, Maria Theresa faced enemies on all sides. Bavaria, France, Saxony, and Spain all joined Prussia, each with their own territorial claims and ambitions to dismantle her inheritance. Maria Theresa could have crumbled. Her treasury was depleted, her army was in disarray, and her court was filled with aging, cautious advisors. But what her enemies underestimated was her sheer, unyielding will. She was fiercely intelligent, incredibly determined, and possessed a deeply personal sense of her right to rule. She would not surrender an inch of her inheritance. Her first critical move was to appeal directly to the Hungarian nobility. Hungary, a restless part of the Habsburg Empire, had a history of rebellion. In 1741, Maria Theresa traveled to Pressburg, modern-day Bratislava, the Hungarian capital, and appeared before the Hungarian parliament holding her infant son, Joseph. In a famous and dramatic speech, she pleaded for their loyalty and aid. Speaking Latin, the language of the Hungarian nobility, and appealing to their chivalry, she promised to respect their ancient liberties. The Hungarian nobles, moved by her courage and vulnerability, famously declared, "Vitam et sanguinem pro nostra regina," our lives and blood for our queen. This moment galvanized Hungarian support, providing her with much-needed troops and resources. This was not an act of sentimental weakness. It was a shrewd, calculated move by a monarch fighting for survival. She knew she needed every ally she could find, and she was willing to make promises to secure military aid. Throughout the long, complex war, Maria Theresa displayed an incredible capacity for ruthless pragmatism. She learned quickly, taking charge of military strategy, dismissing incompetent generals, and personally overseeing financial reforms to fund the war effort. She worked relentlessly, often until the early hours of the morning, managing a vast empire, while also raising a large family. The war lasted for 8 long years. From 1740 to 1748, it was a brutal conflict fought across multiple fronts in Europe and even in the colonies. Maria Theresa's forces suffered defeats, but they also achieved significant victories. Despite losing Silesia to Frederick the Great, a loss that she would never truly accept and would fuel future conflicts, she managed to hold on to the vast majority of her inheritance. She defended Bohemia against Prussian and Bavarian invasions, secured her husband Francis Stephen's election as Holy Roman Emperor, and most importantly kept the Habsburg monarchy intact as a major European power. The Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748 finally brought peace. Maria Theresa was formally recognized as the sovereign of the Habsburg monarchy. The price was the permanent loss of Silesia to Prussia, a deeply painful concession, but one she was willing to make to save the whole. Her willingness to sacrifice a valuable province, however dearly held, to secure the overall survival of her empire, demonstrated a cold, hard strategic realism. She mourned the loss of Silesia, but she politicized the preservation of the greater whole. Maria Theresa's fight for her crown stands as a testament to her unyielding will and her profound understanding of power politics. She began as an untested queen, facing a continent eager to dismember her inheritance, and she ended as one of Europe's most formidable rulers, respected and feared in equal measure. Her ruthless determination to fight for every inch of her patrimony, to forge alliances through cunning diplomacy, and to make tough concessions when absolutely necessary, cemented the Habsburg dynasty's position in Europe for another 2 centuries. She proved that, while a woman might not inherit the Holy Roman Empire, she could certainly rule an empire with an iron will. Number 3. Charles V's imperial fury unleashed on Rome. In the year 1527, a chill wind of change swept across Europe. The Protestant Reformation, sparked by Martin Luther, was gaining ground. The political landscape was a tangled mess of alliances and rivalries. At the center of it all was Charles V, the young, powerful Habsburg emperor, who ruled over a vast empire that spanned from Spain to Austria and included vast territories in Italy and the New World. Charles saw himself as divinely appointed protector of the Catholic Church and the unifier of Christendom. However, his relationship with the Pope Clement VII was anything but harmonious. Pope Clement VII, a member of the powerful Medici family, was more of a politician than a spiritual leader. He constantly shifted allegiances, playing European powers against each other to preserve the temporal power and independence of the Papal States. He feared Charles V's growing dominance in Italy and began to ally with France, Charles's traditional rival, against the emperor. This was a profound betrayal in Charles's eyes, especially given that the Pope was supposed to be the spiritual head of the very church Charles was pledged to defend. The Pope's actions were seen not just as political maneuvering, but as a direct challenge to imperial authority and a grave insult to Charles's role as protector of the faith. Adding to the volatile situation were Charles V's imperial armies. These were not simply national forces. They were a motley crew of mercenaries from various parts of Europe, including Spanish veterans, German Landsknechts, many of whom were Lutheran, and Italian soldiers. They were, however, poorly paid, their wages often delayed or non-existent. By the spring of 1527, a large imperial army, numbering around 34,000 men, was marching through Italy. Their commander, Charles III, Duke of Bourbon, a former French nobleman who had defected to Charles V, was struggling to control his increasingly unruly and mutinous troops. They were hungry, frustrated, and eager for plunder. In May, this formidable unpaid army found itself outside the walls of Rome, the Eternal City, the seat of the papacy. Despite the fact that they were ostensibly fighting for the Catholic emperor, many of the German soldiers were staunch Lutherans who harbored deep resentments against the Catholic Church and its perceived wealth and corruption. The combination of religious animosity, desperate hunger, and a complete breakdown of discipline created a perfect storm. On May 6, 1527, the imperial army stormed Rome. The resistance was brief and ineffective. The Duke of Bourbon was killed in the initial assault, which further ignited the soldiers' fury, leaving them without a clear commander to rein them in. What followed was an act of savagery that shocked Europe, even in an age of brutal warfare. For over 8 months, Rome was subjected to an orgy of looting, destruction, torture, and murder. Churches were desecrated, sacred relics stolen, palaces ransacked, and countless civilians, regardless of their status or religious affiliation, were killed, raped, or tortured for their valuables. Swiss guards fought heroically to protect Pope Clement VII, allowing him to escape through a secret passage to the Castel Sant'Angelo, where he was effectively imprisoned by the imperial forces. The magnificent libraries were destroyed, artistic treasures were defaced or stolen, and the streets ran red with blood. Accounts from the time described scenes of utter devastation, with houses left empty, churches ruined, and the city's population drastically reduced by death, disease, and flight. Charles V was thousands of miles away when the sack of Rome occurred. He claimed he did not order it, and was horrified by the extent of the devastation. He even dressed in mourning as a gesture of remorse. However, his actions or lack thereof before the event certainly contributed to the catastrophe. He had allowed his troops to remain unpaid and hungry, providing the conditions for a breakdown of order. And crucially, he benefited immensely from the outcome. The Pope, humiliated ineffectively, his prisoner was forced to make peace with Charles, recognizing his dominance in Italy and agreeing to crown him emperor. The sack of Rome sent a chilling message across Europe. No power, not even the Pope himself, was safe from the wrath of the Habsburg emperor. It demonstrated Charles V's immense power and his willingness to exert it, directly or indirectly, in a brutally effective manner to achieve his political aims. It showcased the raw, unbridled force that could be unleashed by a vast mercenary army serving a powerful emperor, even if it meant devastating the very heart of the Catholic world. The event deeply scarred the papacy and marked a turning point in the relationship between secular imperial power and spiritual authority. With the balance firmly tipping in favor of the emperor, it was a shocking display of imperial fury, a testament to a ruthless pragmatism that prioritized political dominance above all else. Number 2. Philip II's reign of terror in the Netherlands. The Netherlands in the mid-16th century was a jewel in the Habsburg crown. A collection of wealthy, industrious provinces with thriving port cities and a burgeoning merchant class, they contributed a huge portion of the Spanish Habsburg Empire's revenue. But beneath this surface of prosperity, deep tensions simmered. The Netherlands had a tradition of local autonomy and self-governance, With powerful urban councils and provincial estates, they were also a fertile ground for the spread of Protestantism, particularly Calvinism, which challenged the strict Catholic orthodoxy of their ruler, Philip II, the devout Habsburg king of Spain. Philip II, the son of Emperor Charles V, inherited the Netherlands in 1556. Unlike his father, who had grown up partly in the Low Countries and spoke their languages, Philip was a quintessential Spaniard. He ruled from his vast palace monastery, the Escorial, near Madrid, and viewed the distant Netherlands through the lens of a centralized absolutist monarch. He believed deeply in the concept of one king, one law, one faith. For Philip, the religious diversity and local liberties of the Netherlands were not cherished traditions, but dangerous aberrations that threatened both his divine authority and the spiritual purity of his realms. Philip's determination to enforce religious conformity and centralized power led him to introduce the Spanish Inquisition into the Netherlands and to reorganize the Catholic Church there, creating new bishoprics, which many saw as an attempt to assert greater royal control. He also issued harsh edicts against heresy, making it a capital offense to be a Protestant or even to possess Protestant texts. These measures were met with growing resentment and resistance from the local nobility and populace who feared the loss of their traditional rights and freedoms. The situation exploded in 1566 with the Beeldenstorm, or iconoclastic fury. Calvinist mobs, enraged by the persecution and the perceived idolatry of Catholic churches, stormed cathedrals and monasteries, smashing statues, defacing paintings, and destroying religious artifacts. This widespread act of defiance, though condemned by many, pushed Philip II to the brink. He saw it as open rebellion, an unforgivable affront to God and to his royal authority. Philip's response was swift, brutal, and utterly uncompromising. In 1567, he dispatched Fernando Alvarez de Toledo, the Duke of Alba, to the Netherlands with a veteran army of 10,000 Spanish and Italian soldiers. Alba was a stern, unyielding general, known for his cruelty and efficiency in suppressing dissent. His arrival signaled the end of any hope for peaceful negotiation. His mission was clear: crush the rebellion, root out heresy, and establish absolute royal control, no matter the cost. Alba immediately established a special tribunal, officially called the Council of Troubles, but quickly dubbed the Blood Council by the terrified Dutch population. This court bypassed all traditional legal procedures and local authorities. It handed down sentences with chilling speed and severity. Thousands were arrested on suspicion of heresy, treason, or participation in the iconoclastic fury. Property was confiscated on a massive scale, enriching the crown and its loyal supporters. Public executions, often by hanging, beheading, or burning at the stake, became a common sight in towns across the Netherlands. Estimates suggest that Alba's council was responsible for the execution of over 1,000 people, though many more likely died in the chaos or fled the country. Prominent nobles like the Counts of Egmont and Hoorn, who were Catholic but had opposed Philip's policies, were publicly executed in Brussels, sending a clear message that no one was safe. Alba's reign of terror did not achieve its desired effect of stamping out rebellion. Instead, it ignited a full-scale uprising. William of Orange, a Dutch nobleman who had initially fled, returned to lead the resistance. His forces, often called the Beggars, waged a guerrilla war by land and sea against the Spanish. What began as a religious and political protest escalated into the 80 Years' War, a devastating conflict that would eventually lead to the independence of the northern provinces of the Netherlands, forming the Dutch Republic. Philip II, despite the immense cost in lives and treasure, never wavered in his determination. He poured vast sums of money and endless streams of soldiers into the Netherlands, maintaining his uncompromising stance for decades. He was willing to sacrifice the prosperity of his richest provinces and condemn generations to brutal warfare rather than concede on matters of faith and royal authority. His ruthless commitment to religious orthodoxy and centralized power, enforced with an iron fist by the Duke of Alba, sparked one of the longest and most destructive wars in European history, irrevocably altering the political and religious landscape of the continent. It stands as a stark example of a monarch's willingness to inflict immense suffering and economic ruin in pursuit of absolute control and rigid ideological purity. Number 1. Ferdinand II's Iron Hammer, after the Defenestration. The year is 1618. Europe is a powder keg of religious and political tensions ready to explode. Nowhere is this more apparent than in Bohemia, a largely Protestant kingdom within the Holy Roman Empire, ruled by the staunchly Catholic Habsburgs. The Bohemian nobility, mostly Protestant, had long enjoyed certain religious freedoms and political rights, guaranteed by a document called the Letter of Majesty. However, the new Habsburg monarch Ferdinand II had other ideas. He was a fervent, uncompromising Catholic, educated by Jesuits and utterly convinced of his divine mission to restore Catholicism throughout his domains. Ferdinand, even before he was officially crowned King of Bohemia, began to implement policies that chipped away at Protestant rights. He suppressed Protestant gatherings, appointed Catholic officials to positions of power, and most provocatively ordered the closure of Protestant churches in areas where local lords disputed their right to exist. This was seen by the Bohemian estates, the local parliament, as a direct violation of their treasured Letter of Majesty. On May 23, 1618, a delegation of angry Protestant Bohemian nobles marched to Hradčany Castle in Prague, the seat of Habsburg power in Bohemia. They confronted two imperial governors, Vilém Slavata and Jaroslav Borita of Martinez, and their secretary Philip Fabricius. After a heated argument, the Bohemian nobles, following an ancient Bohemian tradition for dealing with unpopular officials, threw the three men out of a high window of the castle. This event, known as the Second Defenestration of Prague, was not just an act of defiance. It was a deliberate, violent rejection of Habsburg authority and a direct challenge to Ferdinand. It lit the fuse that ignited the 30 Years' War, one of the most destructive conflicts in European history. Ferdinand, now Emperor and King of Bohemia, did not hesitate. He viewed the Defenestration and the subsequent Bohemian Rebellion as an act of treason and heresy that required absolute, unforgiving retribution. The Bohemians, seeking to protect their freedoms, deposed Ferdinand and elected Frederick V, the Protestant Elector, Palatine, as their new king. This was an even greater insult to Ferdinand and a direct threat to his dynasty's power and religious mission. Ferdinand moved swiftly to crush the rebellion. He assembled a powerful army financed by Spain and led by the brilliant Catholic League commander Count Tilly. On November 8, 1620, less than 2.5 years after the Defenestration, the Imperial and Catholic League forces met the Bohemian rebel army. Just outside Prague, the battle was decisive and devastating. The Bohemian forces were routed in less than 2 hours. It was a complete and utter victory for Ferdinand II. The aftermath of White Mountain was a chilling display of Ferdinand's ruthless determination to impose his will and faith. He did not seek reconciliation or compromise. Instead, he unleashed an iron hammer of vengeance and repression that fundamentally reshaped Bohemia for centuries. The first, most public and shocking act of retribution occurred in June 1621. 27 Bohemian Protestant leaders, including nobles, burghers, and scholars, were rounded up, tried by a special tribunal controlled by Ferdinand, and condemned to death. On June 21st, in Prague's Old Town Square, in a gruesome public spectacle, they were systematically executed. 12 of them were beheaded. Others were hanged, and some suffered even more brutal fates. Their heads were then impaled on spikes and displayed on the Charles Bridge as a horrifying warning. This act of mass execution sent a terrifying message. Resistance to Ferdinand II would be met with the most extreme punishment, but the repression went far beyond executions. Ferdinand launched a systematic campaign of land confiscation. Thousands of Protestant nobles and burghers who had participated in or sympathized with the rebellion had their property seized by the crown. These Vast estates, which represented immense wealth and power, were then often sold off cheaply to Ferdinand's loyal Catholic supporters, many of whom were foreign adventurers or imperial generals. This created a new Catholic landowning aristocracy in Bohemia loyal directly to the Habsburgs and irrevocably dispossessed the old Protestant nobility. This massive transfer of wealth and power crippled the Bohemian Protestant aristocracy and secured Habsburg control over the kingdom for generations. Alongside the political and economic repression came a relentless campaign of forced re-Catholicization. Protestant ministers were expelled, their churches closed, and Protestant worship was outlawed. Jesuits, acting as Ferdinand's spiritual shock troops, were brought in to preach, educate, and convert the population. People were given a stark choice: convert to Catholicism or face severe penalties, including exile and the loss of their property. Many chose to leave Bohemia, becoming refugees and taking their skills and wealth with them. The Bohemian language and culture were suppressed in favor of German and Catholic influences. This period, known as the Dark Age in Czech history, saw a dramatic shift in Bohemia's demographics, religion, and social structure. It transformed Bohemia from a largely Protestant self-governing kingdom into a firmly Catholic absolute dominion of the Habsburgs, politically and culturally tied to Vienna. Ferdinand II's actions after the defenestration of Prague in the Battle of White Mountain were not just a military victory. They were a complete and utter transformation of an entire kingdom through brutal force, systematic repression, and unforgiving vengeance. It was a clear, unambiguous statement that the Habsburgs would crush any defiance with an iron hammer, demonstrating a ruthless commitment to absolute power and religious uniformity that set the tone for their dynasty's role in the bloody tapestry of European history.